Hi, welcome to Bernard's Book Club, and the book that we've been looking at is Techno Feudalism by Yanis Varoufakis, a tight, compelling and original Marxist rethink of its own categories, the transformative power of technology and the trajectory of capitalism, attempting to adapt key tenets of Marxist thought to new realities whose scale and nature would have been inconceivable to Marx himself. And I'm going to set out its ideas here in 4 parts, which I've called Positioning Varoufakis, Capitalist Metamorphosis before Techno Feudalism, the rise of the Cloudalists and Techno Feudalism, and finally, Consequences. So, kicking off then with Part 1, Positioning Varoufakis. And I think this is important, as to understand Varoufakis, we need to be clear where he's coming from intellectually, because the argument that he makes and the way that he makes it is, in many ways, like himself, unusual. He is simultaneously an economist, public intellectual and political activist, made famous as the Greek finance minister, and his willingness to directly confront the institutions of European and global capitalism for what he saw as its pointless and cruel imposition of austerity. And this merging of the political, intellectual and personal seeps into his writing, much of which is framed by personal stories and peppered with Greek mythology, so that he's a storyteller, and in Techno-Feudalism his argument unfolds through fragmented memories and imagined conversations with his father, responding to his dad's scepticism and circling around his question, now that computers speak to each other, will this make capitalism impossible to overthrow? Which Varoufakis uses as a device around which he builds his argument. He's also a materialist, telling us how, as a child, he was introduced to various metals, described as his father's friends, in nightly performances of a magical fire-forged alchemy, where tin, bronze and iron were metamorphized in shape and strength, which Yanis later described as his dad inducting him into historical materialism and the transformative power of technology. And this attention to material forces as agents of constant, dramatic and sometimes terrible change underpins his thought, though it's important to say that he's also a sceptical materialist, aware that social power very much shapes the use of material power. And finally, and encompassing all of these, he is politically, temperamentally and intellectually a Marxist. And this is useful to know because it helps explain aspects of his thinking that otherwise might be confusing. Because like Keynes and Marx, but unlike most orthodox economists, his understanding of economics always goes beyond the boundaries of orthodoxy, beyond its laws, equations, flow diagrams and numbers, which for Keynes, Marx and Varoufakis offer only a surface description of how the economy works. And so to fully get the significance and account for the impact of such things as technology, labour or money, they should not be understood simply for their role as factors in economic production, but also reflect wider human experience, individual psychology and the deeper workings of society. And one of the best examples of this is the Marxist idea that the economic system is also a structure of power, that, in other words, it has a dual or a second nature. And so in the same way that Marx saw money as not just a commodity, but also as the alienated ability of mankind, Varoufakis sees such things as labour as not simply just a commodity, but something holding within it expressly human qualities such as passion and flair that he calls experiential labour. But just as he's a sceptical materialist, he's also not a typical Marxist either, because he's animated above all else, above even justice and equality, by freedom. And it's as a libertarian Marxist that he condemns capitalism, and he does so in the name of freedom. Added to this, he's also what you might call an adaptive Marxist, which is to say he uses the Marxist frame to analyse history and society all the way up to what he sees as the death of capitalism, at which point he deviates from the script, arguing that capitalism has been ended not by the proletariat as conventional Marxism has it, but by a mutation of itself. And while this is not a traditional Marxist ending, arguably and in a larger sense, it is an adaptation driven by the logic of Marxism itself, adapted to realities not previously visible. So it's within these parameters of instinct, politics and intellectual disposition that Varoufakis makes his argument that we now live in something called Techno Feudalism. But before addressing what this might mean, Varoufakis seeks first of all to locate the rise of Techno Feudalism in the wider evolution of capitalism, which brings us to part 2, capitalist metamorphosis before Techno Feudalism. And the first thing to say here is that metamorphosis is wired into the DNA of capitalism. Indeed, change is its only constant, changing not only the world it encounters, but also its own structure and form. It is the great shapeshifter, commodifying and absorbing all it encounters, and it's constantly adapting to preserve and extend itself. And as such, it's been metamorphizing since its beginning. And in order to understand its latest mutation into techno-feudalism, Varoufakis identifies 3 prior transformations across the 20th and early 21st century, which serve to set the scene for the rise of techno-feudalism, as well as illustrating his Marxist insight that, from its beginning, capitalism has been supported and nurtured by agencies outside of its own structure, agencies that have sought to protect, guide and extend its workings, all of which can be seen in these 3 prior forms of capitalism, out of whose crises and mutations techno-feudalism will emerge. And Varoufakis calls these, firstly, the New Deal and war economy, secondly, the Techno Structure, and thirdly, the Global American Minotaur. Of these, the New Deal from 1933 to 39 is perhaps the most familiar, built on the Keynesian insight that when capitalism enters into a depression, the state has both the capacity and the duty to stabilise both the economy and the wider society it should serve. And under Roosevelt's New Deal, American capitalism, now the face of capitalism itself, was saved from itself and a doom loop that began with the Wall Street crash and ended in the Second World War and delivered, amongst other things, mass unemployment and fascism. And while it did not prevent the war, the Keynesian-inspired New Deal did save both the American economy and its society, accomplished by a programme of public works, social welfare and controls over bankers. And whilst the state has always been a feature of capitalism, here was a significant modification in the capitalist ecosystem and a dress rehearsal for the war economy, extending still further the state's role, and whose planned production and controlled prices was such that Varoufakis argues it is no exaggeration to say that American capitalism was now run according to Soviet principles. And it was a fantastic success. American corporations produced what was necessary to win the war, and in exchange, the state gave them guaranteed profits, freedom from competition, and government-funded scientific research, with the result that production quadrupled, inflation stabilised, and unemployment disappeared, and by the war's end, American capitalism was unrecognisable. But war's end was always going to be a big challenge for capitalism and the people and agencies that run it, because like all modern wars, the Second World War had been a relentless driver for capitalist expansion. And the challenge facing post-war American state-enabled capitalism was not only how to maintain its existing markets, but also how to maintain the capitalist imperative for continuous expansion now that the war was no more and European capitalist economies were all but destroyed. And rising to this challenge emerged a new and more far-reaching enabling structure for post-war capitalism that the great economist Kenneth Galbraith called the Techno Structure. And this is the second of the pre-techno feudal forms of capitalism, which Varoufakis describes as a network of state and corporate bodies, of public and private institutions, and whose army of technicians and professionals, mathematicians, scientists, analysts and managers were given immense resources, all deployed to sustain big business and expand the markets for the American-dominated post-war capitalist world. And again, as with the war economy, the great surprise was how closely this approach echoed Soviet principles. As Varoufakis puts it, the rise of the techno structure transformed American capitalism from a decentralized market society into a centralized economy with markets. It was what the Soviet planners had always hoped to achieve, but had failed. And again, this new enabling structure for capitalism, part state, part business, was spectacularly successful and proved a powerful instrument to implement what Varoufakis calls the American Global Plan, which was firstly to stabilise post-war capitalism and secondly to set in train renewed and continuous expansion. The stabilising part of the plan was tackled by the state component of the techno structure, where American government officials constructed nothing less than a new global financial system, known by the place name of where it was devised as Bretton Woods, explicitly designed for stability and especially to prevent another Great Depression. And it did this by giving massive aid to the broken economies of Europe and Japan and then integrating them into the American system by remonetarizing their currencies and anchoring them to the dollar at fixed exchange rates, and therefore by holding them in a strong and stable system backed by capital controls and America's enormous economic power. In effect, it remade Europe and Japan in its own image and integrated them not only into its economy but into its technostructure, all of which was institutionally managed by the American-dominated International Monetary Fund and World Bank. And in this, Bretton Woods not only stabilised but extended capitalist markets. And this was also further and greatly expanded, this time by the corporate component of the technostructure, with commercial experts and creative types brought into its structure to work out new ways to manipulate our attention, manufacture desire and commodify nostalgia, all of which for Varoufakis is exemplified in the fictional genius of Mad Men's Don Draper as the capitalist magus, able to penetrate the catacombs of our psyche to seek out as yet uncommodified emotions, magically transforming such things as a Hershey's chocolate bar into a simulacrum of a dead father's caress. And in all of this, the American technostructure, with its state technicians, corporate creatives and global plan, made Europe and Japan component parts of its own system and laid the foundations for capitalists' golden age of low inflation, high growth, low unemployment and diminished inequality. Now, it's important to say that this was a success dependent on American power and in particular on American economic performance, because the whole structure depended on the American dollar backed by American gold. And for it to work, dollars held by Europe and later Asia would need to come back to America so that its stock of gold, central to its economic status, would remain undiminished. And for this to happen, America would have to continue to sell more to the world than it imported, and as long as it did, its store of gold would remain intact. But by the early 1970s, the cost to America of its Vietnam War and President Johnson's Great Society programme, as well as the growing economic performance of Germany and Japan, made America uncompetitive and turned it from a surplus to a deficit economy, which is to say it bought more from the world than it sold and was now shedding gold at an unsustainable rate. And slowly the Bretton Woods arrangement became a drain to, rather than an instrument of, American power. And as before, American policymakers had to pull off another of its great capitalist transformations. This time, the challenge was how to end Bretton Woods and repurpose its institutions while keeping America in command of the global economy. Put differently, it was how to get the world to continue to buy dollars, no longer backed by its gold or its economic performance. And this was a difficult trick to pull off. But President Nixon calculated correctly that Europe and Japan would continue to buy dollars despite their value no longer guaranteed by gold, because America would continue to be a safe harbour for the world's money by virtue of its raw military and political power. So, in a controlled dismantling of the system, America decoupled Europe's currencies from the dollar, again transforming capitalism to create another mutation and the final pre-techno feudal form that Varoufakis, with his liking for Greek myth, calls the Global American Minotaur, whose original appearance was as a fierce and tragic mythological creature who lived in the king's labyrinth, was necessary for the peace and prosperity of the realm, but whose unbearable loneliness required it to be fed by human sacrifice and given tribute in the form of human flesh. And likewise, this new American Minotaur would now be constantly fed tribute, only this time and in the real world, receiving the world's profits, despite the fact that America had become a debtor nation. And the world's capitalists were willing to do this because America's power kept Europe and Asia peaceful and prosperous and made it safe to conduct the world's trade in dollars. And in return, foreign owners of distant factories sent their profits and cash back to Wall Street. And this was the deal between America and the rest of the capitalist world, whereby America bought most of the world's produce, and in return, the world invested its revenues in American stocks and shares, and this was the foundation upon which the system would now be conducted, and which for Varoufakis marked the reign of the Global American Minotaur. Later, the Chinese version of this, that one Chinese official called its dark deal with America, saw America's ruling class agree a shift in industrial production to Chinese factories and to keep buying what they produced if the Chinese ruling class would send their profits back to Wall Street. And it was described as dark because while it suited the ruling classes of both countries, it generated misery for their workers. And so began the reign of the Minotaur, or what other people have called globalization or financialization, which are really different names giving different emphasis to different aspects of the same process. And the move to the Global American Minotaur was at the same time a move away from corporate to financial power, from outcompeted industry to the world of bankers and money and finance, during which American industry would be hollowed out and its workers abandoned, but its financial wizards, legitimated and lionized by neoliberal ideology, were about to become the new masters of the universe. And very soon, the reign of the Global American Minotaur would become a rampage, as the demise of the Soviet Union further announced America's unrivaled power and removed what seemed like the final barrier to free-flowing planetary capitalism. And then China came into the system, bringing with it a massive market and close to 1 billion workers. and the torrent of capital rushing to America, to the Minotaur, grew into a tsunami, all of which gave Wall Street the confidence, in the words of Varoufakis, to run amok and take capitalism to the brink. And central to this was the way that computer technology, now growing exponentially, allowed financiers to complicate and hide risk in unfathomable complexity, and to create new financial instruments such as derivatives, as one more way to extract still more capital for the financial Minotaur, this time from mostly poor owners of American subprime mortgages, whose debt was diced, packed, processed and hidden in computer-generated complexity and then sold on, piling debt upon debt never intended to be collected until the system came crashing down. And with this, the 2008 economic crisis announced the conclusion to the reign of the Minotaur, which had gobbled up everything produced by Japan and later China and sucked in the wealth of the world. And the more it grew, the greater its appetite. And the more it consumed, the bigger its deficits, and the bigger its deficits, the more it gambled, until in 2008 it died in the convulsions of economic meltdown. And by dying, it forced capitalism into its last and fateful metamorphosis. And by this time, the Minotaur had manufactured all the props of our current drama: big finance, big tech, neoliberalism, colossal debts, and industrial scale inequality. It's true, the rest of the world continues to send most of its profits to Wall Street, but the recycling mechanism is broken, and neither bailouts for bankers or staggering amounts of computer-generated money has been able to revive the beast's capacity to recycle the world's profits. And whilst no one was looking, Techno Feudalism quietly emerged from the wreckage. Which brings us to part 3, the rise of the Cloudalists and Techno Feudalism. And this final mutation is not an adjustment or a supplement of a previously existing thing, but a transformation into a wholly new species of capital, bringing with it its own economic, social and political order, as well as a new ruling class. And this latest turn of the capitalist wheel all began in the political choices made by politicians and their central banks in the face of the 2008 crisis. And crucially, their decision not to punish those responsible for the crash, choosing instead what has been called socialism for the bankers and austerity for everybody else. Which is to say, the banks were saved by creating vast amounts of digital cash in a bonanza of money-making made in the hope that throwing money at financiers would stimulate investment, generate jobs and prevent economic collapse. Now, it's important to say that it did enable capitalism to continue, but fatefully the investment didn't come, because austerity had diminished the living standards and the spending power of most people, and therefore businesses refused to invest because they knew that consumers had no money with which to buy their products. As Varoufakis put it, poison money flowed in torrents, but not into serious investments, good quality jobs, or anything capable of reanimating capitalism's lost animal spirits. Instead, shareholders and executives bought land, empty warehouses, art, Swiss chalets, whole villages in Italy, and even islands in Greece. But beneath this conspicuous consumption, the decision to print money en masse while presiding over austerity, a decision massively amplified by the pandemic, producing still more mountains of central bank cash, proved to be a once-in-a-lifetime golden opportunity for the rise of big tech, or what Varoufakis calls the Cloudalists. Because although traditional capitalists chose not to invest, the up-and-coming Cloudalists certainly did, and without having to borrow money or even make profits, they assembled ultra-powerful cloud capital, building an infrastructure of servers, self-learning algorithms and structures of surveillance. And in what for them was a fabulous pandemic, they very quietly and beneath the drama of lockdown amassed all that would be necessary for their out-of-sight revolution. In their minds, the central bankers had been saving capitalism all along. In reality, they were financing its successor. And in order to understand the significance of this, we need now to unpack not only what constitutes cloud capital, but the whole scaffolding of ideas and arguments, processes and operations that together make up Varoufakis' conception of techno feudalism. So, beginning with cloud capital, which at its simplest is no more than the ownership of vast data warehouses with endless rows of servers connected by a globe-spanning web of sensors and cables, which is to say that cloud capital is the physical reality behind our common sense idea of the cloud as a gigantic store of digital information made familiar to millions through their phones and devices. Now, this is fine as far as it goes, but it completely fails to capture its power or revolutionary potential. And for that, we need to return to economics, and in particular, to understand the difference between two things, between rent and profit, and between capitalist markets and feudal fiefdoms. Starting then with rent, we all have a common sense idea of this as a charge made by landlords to tenants for a place to live. But Varoufakis tells us that the concept extends significantly beyond this. At bottom, it's a payment made to those who have privileged access to things that are valuable and in fixed supply. This can be fertile soil, land containing fossil fuels, or even the brand loyalty given to a particular product. But what is crucial is that as a form of income, rent does not require the production or sale of any commodity, which is to say it doesn't create anything and it doesn't bring anything new into the world. No new inventions, no new artifacts and no new value. It is simply payment made by one person to use what is owned by someone else. On the other hand, profit is entirely different. It requires entrepreneurs to invest in things that don't otherwise exist. And crucially, it can only be generated in the context of market competition, as the competitive buying and selling of new commodities produced by the constant attempt to invent new products, either better or as yet undiscovered by rivals. And it's here that we can find the key difference between capitalism and feudalism. Feudalism is a fixed, static, social and political order based on the ownership of land, organised around kings and the distribution by kings of smaller pieces of land called fiefs or fiefdoms, which are given to subordinate knights and lords called vassals as a reward for their support, and which in turn gives them the right to extract rent from their peasant serfs, which is to say, to extract a proportion of what their peasants produced. Capitalism, on the other hand, is a constantly moving, highly dynamic social and political order based on the ownership of capital, organised around profits and generated in continuously shifting markets and dependent on endless innovation and uninterrupted growth. To summarise these differences, the two defining properties of capitalism are profits and markets, while the two defining properties of feudalism are rent and fiefs or fiefdoms. And it's with these definitions that Varoufakis makes the argument that the new digital cloud platforms, Amazon, Google, Uber and the rest, do not constitute, as some have argued, a new form of platform capitalism, but rather are the new digital fiefdoms of our age, animated not by profit and markets, but by rent and the logic of feudalism, now turbocharged by 21st century technology, and which today are the new forces in an unplanned and in many ways barely visible revolution. Barely visible because it emerged not from the drama of political upheaval, but from what at first sight looks more like a simple and very mundane business decision, when Apple invited third-party developers to use free Apple software to produce apps exclusively for sale via the Apple Store and for which Apple took a percentage of their sale. And with this deceptively simple move, the Apple Store became the first cloud fief, an exclusive digital space that produced nothing and to which app developers had to pay rent in order that they may reach their customers, while their customers willingly and continuously gave their data, attention and unpaid labour in order that they may access what Varoufakis calls a ticket to a vast vista of Apple-enabled pleasures and abilities, which is to say that digital platforms became a magnet for the attention of practically everybody. And this constant and active attention given by virtually all of us is the animating core of the system, a gift that keeps giving, locking buyers and sellers alike into a singular self-contained and self-generating space, which Varoufakis argues is a capitalist free domain, organised and driven by very different imperatives. And what we have instead is a digital fiefdom, where vassal capitalists pay to be given permission to sell their wares in a system made alive by the labour of happy data serfs tirelessly toiling away, making a tiny band of what some have called platform capitalists, but which Varoufakis calls Cloudalists, fabulously wealthy, and all without a competitor, the need to produce anything, or even make a profit. And soon, Apple was joined by Google with its own cloud empire, including Gmail, YouTube, Google Maps, and its Android operating system, which became the foundation for its alternative to the Apple Store, Google Play, as a new fief in the emergent techno-feudal landscape. And soon this template for digital feudalism, which is to say of selling physical goods via global supply chains through an exclusive cloud platform and extracting rent from vassal capitalists so that they can access their customers, was both followed and perfected by Amazon, eBay, Alibaba and numerous imitators in Asia and Africa, and it's been extended and adapted to accommodate a vast array of services, including drivers and cleaners and restaurateurs and of course taxis. As Varoufakis puts it, from factory owners in America's Midwest to poets struggling to sell their latest anthology, from London Uber drivers to Indonesian street hawkers, all are now dependent on some cloud fief for access to customers. And in doing all of this, Varoufakis argues that the emergent Cloudalists have proved more powerful and more revolutionary than any of their predecessors, developing capacities that previous types of capital could only dream of, such as the capacity to know and command us, using neural networks, machine learning and self-training algorithms that almost simultaneously reprogram and alter themselves in response to our endless feed of data, learning our preferences and habits, exploiting our biases, monetarizing our emotions, curating our reality, and, as Varoufakis puts it, breathing something resembling agency into the algorithms now shaping our choices. As he puts it, by surveying the reaction of millions of people to their prompts billions of times every hour, they train themselves at lightning speeds, not only to influence us, but to be influenced by the way they influence us, constantly monitoring and incessantly reacting to the outcomes of their own actions. They are also a magnet for free labour on an unprecedented scale, turning us into serfs who, through our own unpaid labour, which is to say our incessant posting, uploading and even our movement through space, we are all continuously working to produce and reproduce the stock of cloud capital, again enriching the same multi-billionaires now crystallising to become a new ruling class. To this can be added its greater capacity to command what may be thought of as old-style workers, creating cloud proletarians or cloud proles, which is to say conventional paid workers now subject to unprecedented surveillance and control, again through algorithms connected to the company's neural network, and whose priority is to squeeze from their human workers every last drop of productive energy by tracking and dictating their every move in what Varoufakis describes as a modernist nightmare reminiscent of that portrayed in Fritz Lang's classic film Metropolis. And finally, they exercise unprecedented control as the designers and controllers of all the platforms through which we communicate, where, for instance, Varoufakis tells us the Amazon fiefdom may be seen as analogous to a town where all the shops, buildings, benches, the air that we breathe, and everything seen is owned by a man called Jeff. You and I may walk next to each other, our eyes trained in the same direction, but the view provided by the algorithm is entirely bespoke, curated according to Jeff's priorities, while everyone is navigating their way around in algorithmically constructed isolation. And all of this taken together, the replacement of capitalist markets by self-contained fiefs, the substitution of rent over profit, the unprecedented forms of algorithmic power and command are what constitute techno-feudalism and determine it as a wholly new economic and political order. Having said this, and in the same way that the outward vestiges of feudalism continued long after its inward power was replaced by capitalism, so old-style capitalism, with its markets and profits, remain ubiquitous. And perhaps surprisingly, Varoufakis fully acknowledges this, arguing that wherever we look today, capital is triumphant, with monuments to its power everywhere, and capitalists continue to own almost everything, run the military-industrial complex, and dominate parliaments, the media, central banks, and all-powerful global institutions. But despite all of this, Varoufakis is clear, at some deeper, more subterranean level, just as consecutive mutations multiply variants of an organism until at some point a new species emerges, so capitalism has become techno-feudalism, something distinct and now in command. Capitalists aren't running the show anymore, and capitalism has been evicted from the epicentre of our economic and social system. And there is deep irony in all of this, because it's precisely from the agents, institutions and logic of capitalism that techno-feudalism emerged as a kind of mutant offspring. And in this sense, capitalism is dying of its own hand. Whilst capital still exists and flourishes, capitalism increasingly does not. Profit is no longer the fuel that fires the global economic engine, and wealth extracted from rent sucks huge volumes of money out of the global value chain. And in this, Varoufakis sees capitalism as experiencing something akin to the shrinking of its habitat, with value constantly extracted, never to re-enter as new economic activity in the circulation of value. And this is just one of many consequences that techno-feudalism has in store for us, which brings us to part 4, consequences. And for Varoufakis, these are deep and profound. At a global level, it will further diminish our unlikely ability to manage climate change, because America and China have become competing super fiefs, edging closer to confrontation. And in this context, the best we can hope for is 2 separate green transitions. And perhaps just as importantly, because of the high-tech nature of renewables, we may have already surrendered our energy systems to the new lords of cloud finance. For the global south, its options are just as bad. Forced once again to choose which feudal lord to submit to, it will have to once again surrender to the dynamic of underdevelopment. Likewise for Europe, who has its own dark deal with America, is still tied to it, and is without a single big tech company, which is to say, without the most important source of power in our time. And because of this, Varoufakis argues, is now in deep trouble and geostrategically irrelevant. Exactly how these future scenarios will play out is impossible to say, but critical to it is the fate of the dark deal, which, like capitalism itself after 2008, continues to live a kind of zombie afterlife, but is now threatened by interests and developments that make its demise possible. And if this does happen, Chinese and American workers are certain to suffer. American rentiers and Chinese capitalists have much to lose, and even Cloudalists in both countries can't know how the demise of the dark deal might impact them. Politically speaking, the prognosis is equally bad for social democrats and liberals. Social democracy, once the bedrock of capitalism's golden years, Varoufakis tells us, has been slowly dying ever since the demise of Bretton Woods, especially after it was lured into a Faustian pact with banks and finance in the 1990s, making social democrats, he argues, intellectually soft and morally complicit, so that when capitalism came crashing down in 2008, it lacked both the mental tools and the moral values to address the criminality of what had taken place. More importantly, today's social democracy lacks power and doesn't have the tools to confront the Cloudalists. Organised labour, the source of its political power, has been comprehensively defeated, and it lacks the policy programme or the ideas to confront the Cloudalists. And given the magnitude of Cloudalist power, the prospects for democracy are no better than for social democracy. Indeed, across the world, Varoufakis tells us that only the Chinese Communist Party has sufficient power to keep the Cloudalists in check, and in a supreme irony offers, he says, the best chance of democratic resistance to Cloudalist power. This, of course, will be a huge stretch for many, perhaps most people. But either way, what's happening in China will be fundamental, because perhaps the biggest consequence from the advent of Techno Feudalism is the possibility of war between America and China. Of course, a rising China has been for some time America's greatest potential threat. And just as America was weakened, China was greatly strengthened by the 2008 crisis, helping to save capitalism and taking up the global economic slack caused by Western austerity. It seized the moment and invested everywhere, making it the new driver for world trade and accumulating huge dollar surpluses, which allowed it to go beyond just feeding profits to Wall Street to become a major investor in Africa and Asia, all of which has turbocharged its own accumulated cloud capital. Indeed, for Varoufakis, Chinese cloud power extends far beyond that wielded by its American counterpart. Taking its 5 biggest Cloudalists, and so we might better appreciate the enormity of their reach, Varoufakis asks us to imagine Google, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Skype, WhatsApp, Snapchat, Amazon, Spotify, Netflix, Disney, Airbnb, Uber and PayPal all rolled into one and directly bound and made subject to its government, generating cloud power beyond the dreams of Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk, able in a single digital space to regulate urban life, promote financial services, link people with state healthcare, conduct surveillance and guide autonomous vehicles. And this is why Trump and Biden have begun a new Cold War with China, expelling Huawei from Google and blocking its access to critical technologies. At the same time, China has witnessed America freeze more than $3 billion belonging to Russia after its invasion of Ukraine, an unprecedented move that throws doubt on China's own American investments and puts more pressure on the dark deal, which for all its injustices has kept the peace between America and a rising China for decades. And all of this is made worse by the fact that now Chinese Cloudalists like TikTok can trade without dollars siphoning cloud rents directly from America and eradicating the advantage given to America by the dark deal. So that China, having been excluded from American operating systems and platform software, and with a new awareness of the dangers posed to Chinese-owned assets sitting in American banks, the Chinese state has now moved to fully back China's cloud finance, further weakening their allegiance to the dark deal and shifting their allegiance from China's capitalists to its Cloudalists. And at great costs, it has begun to develop its own systems and software, including the development of a digital yuan as the foundation for an alternative international payment system into which Russian money, blocked by the dollar system, is now flowing, all of which threatens American hegemony and explains why America has sought to critically wound the Chinese cloud. However, for Varoufakis, American actions will only slow but not stop the development of Chinese cloud finance, and the repercussions for war and peace cannot be overstated. This then concludes Techno Feudalism by Yanis Varoufakis, an original and stimulating near history of capitalism, its past mutations and future fate, reanimating a Marxist account reformulated for the 21st century.